Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Have you enjoyed this conference? I think you look so tired. I am the Na Seung-il from Seoul National University. I'm the also president of Korea Association of Skills and Qualification. I'll be moderator for this session. Our session is about toward a society that value diverse competencies. You all welcome this session and appreciate for your coming. Let me briefly introduction about our topic. As you know, in Korea, like individual competence should be more valued over mere academic resume in the labor market and society. So it is important to have a comprehensive qualification framework in place to recognize the individual's learning outcome acquired through various pathways be fully recognized. And also to prevent any overlap of qualification. So that's why in Korea we are working on establishing NQF to recognize various competencies while preventing a waste of time and resources stemming from overqualification. During this session, by sharing stories of countries that already have an NQF in place and how Korea has been preparing for its own NQF, in most fitting model for Korea would be found while raising your general awareness of NQF. We have two distinguished presenters and one discussant. So each presenter may use about half hour and a discussant may use like 10 minutes. For the remaining time, we are going to take some question and comment from your audience. Before starting, I will briefly introduce our distinguished speakers and discussant. First, the presenter is Elizabeth Campbell-Dorning. She is the Director of the Qualification Recognition Policy, Australian Government Department of Education and Training. Second presenter is Michael Young, Professor of Sociology of Curriculum, University College London Institute of Education. Finally, the discussant, Dr. Yoon. He is a Senior Research Fellow, Korea Research Institute for Vocational Education and Training. If you want, you could see curriculum vitae of two presenters, discussants from a program book. Let's hear from first speaker. Please join me. Welcome Elizabeth Campbell-Dorning with a big hand for her presentation.
Thank you, Professor Na, and thank you everyone for coming to the last session of two very interesting and busy days. So when I was given the topic of towards a society that values diverse competencies, my first thought was about the Australian Qualifications Framework. So that is going to be the main topic of my discussion today. I will keep it quite high level, and then hopefully in our discussion session we'll explore some of the topics and areas of interest that are most relevant to you in the room, to your considerations for human resources and the opportunities available to Korea in working in this space. So qualifications frameworks, just in general, I'm not sure how familiar everyone in the room is with this concept. Qualifications frameworks are an international development of the past 20, but more frequently in the last 10 years, that are a policy tool in the education and training landscape that aim to promote relevant, consistent and transparent, portable qualifications. And they're primarily qualifications frameworks, a national policy for various national objectives that aim to benefit students and graduates, but also institutions, governments, and employers as well. There are a number of different reasons why a country might decide to develop a national qualifications framework. Some of those reasons are to improve the understanding of their qualifications, both in the country and in other countries. Also as a tool to improve transparency in qualifications, or to improve coordination amongst the sectors involved in education and training, to increase flexibility in learning, and to make qualifications portable so that graduates can use them in different contexts, in different parts of the labour market, in different countries as well. And in particular, one of the reasons that national qualifications frameworks are developed is to improve articulation between sectors, between vocational and higher education, and various other types of articulation, which I will talk about a little later. And one of the ways that they do this is by recognising existing knowledge and skills. Qualifications frameworks invariably have these three aspects to them. They're based on levels and they're based on learning outcomes. That is, what a graduate is expected to know, what they are expected to be able to do, and how they can apply this knowledge and skills in practice, in the workplace or in further education. There are also registers of qualifications and potentially of institutions as well, to contribute to that transparency of what is a qualification. Qualifications frameworks are also very much about lifelong learning. It's about having a flexible framework that supports learners at multiple stages of their journey, and having a system that does not penalise someone for making the wrong choice in terms of what they want to study, or changing their mind about what career they want to pursue. And part of this lifelong learning approach is the validation, not just of formal learning in a university, in a vocational institute, but of non-formal and informal learning as well. So that's learning that's acquired in the workplace, in your social life, various types of circumstances where a student can gain really valuable knowledge and skills, even though it's not in the formal education context. And these objectives of lifelong learning very much contribute to personal fulfillment in students and in the population, contributes to really active citizenship. When people know that the learning that they acquire through non-formal and informal means is valued, is given status within the country's education landscape. It contributes to social inclusion and of course contributes to employability as well, as qualifications frameworks deliver lifelong learning to seek to improve participation of everyone that wants to participate in education and training, and that's a really important factor in the frameworks. In Australia, we have the Australian Qualifications Framework, and one of the things that it has very much helped us achieve in Australia is mobility. And the very vibrant Australian international education sector, where we have hundreds of thousands of students that come to Australia from around the world, and they want to be sure that they have a qualification that they can use when they return home or go to any other country in the world to work. And our qualifications framework helps achieve that by delivering confidence to those students, to their potential employers, in the value and meaning of the qualification that they have achieved in Australia. But Building and implementing a national qualifications framework that is robust, that is respected, takes a lot of time. It's not a quick solution. But with time, a qualifications framework that delivers on national priorities can become a very valuable tool for international cooperation. So here is the Australian qualifications framework. It has 10 levels, and on those 10 levels are 14 different qualification types. It covers all of our what we call post-compulsory education and training. So that is all of our education and training after year 10 in our system. It is based on learning outcomes in the terms of knowledge, of skills, and application of knowledge and skills. The Australian Qualifications Framework is one of the first national qualifications frameworks in the world. It was introduced in 1995. It incorporates qualifications from every sector in Australia's education and training landscape, including schools, vocational education and training, and higher education, into this single comprehensive national qualifications framework. The reason Australia decided to try a qualifications framework was very much to support a broader reform process. Especially in our vocational sector. The reforms were in response to an economic downturn we had in the 1980s and a really strong growing demand for skilled workers from our employers, from our industry. And so with the introduction of the Australian Qualifications Framework came national principles for course accreditation, for the registration of vocational institutions, for credit transfer, for the recognition of prior learning, and policies around consistent assessment were also introduced. Previously, these matters had very much been left to our individual state and territory authorities, so there was not a nationally consistent approach. And that led to a certain lack of confidence from our employers in the skills that our education and training system was delivering. The AQF is important to Australia for a number of reasons, but I will keep it quite simple today. Within the Australian context, the Australian Qualifications Framework has been endorsed by all Australian governments, and it means that qualifications awarded as AQF qualifications are recognised all around Australia across our state and territory borders. At an international level, the AQF means that Australia can describe what an AQF qualification means, the outcomes that can be expected of an AQF qualification to other countries in a really systematic way. It provides a starting point for the recognition of Australian qualifications by other countries. And as more countries develop their own qualifications frameworks, this will enable trust in the quality of education across borders and facilitate the mobility of students and workers as well. So among the purposes of the AQF, primarily to support our economy, to support national productivity through making sure we have relevant qualifications that's relevant to our employers, relevant to industry, that they are consistent across the country and that they are nationally recognised so that workers and students can move around the country with no barriers. The AQF aims to maximise the recognition of knowledge and skills for further study and for work, and it doesn't matter how that knowledge, those skills were acquired, the AQF will recognise them. It promotes access to education, participation in education, and as I mentioned before, lifelong learning. It's definitely a very integral part to our national quality assurance processes. And as I mentioned before, it's about supporting mobility within Australia, but also international mobility between Australia and other countries, between qualifications, between institutions, between sectors, from vocational to higher education or from higher education to vocational, and between education and training and employment. And its very much aim is to deliver trust and confidence in Australian qualifications by any stakeholder that is using them or delivering them, and that's a really important feature. Quality assurance is absolutely fundamental to the Australian Qualifications Framework. It helps us build trust and confidence in Australian qualifications. And we've got a number of different quality assurance agencies that regulate compliance with the Australian Qualifications Framework. In our school sector, that is our state and territory governments, and sometimes they will delegate that authority to another organisation. In our vocational sector, our national regulator is the Australian Skills Quality Agency, and in higher education we have the Tertiary Education Quality Standards Agency. And it is these organisations' responsibilities to make sure that the AQF is being implemented properly by our education and training institutions. And how they do this is through registration of institutions that are providing the education and training that leads to an Australian qualification, and also through the accreditation of courses. And at both of those stages, compliance with the AQF is checked. We also have national registers of institutions and courses, and the purpose of that is to make it very clear to qualification stakeholders whether a qualification is an AQF qualification or not. And that is absolutely critical to building confidence and trust in an AQF qualification. There can be no ambiguity about whether a qualification is quality assured as an AQF qualification or is some other kind of qualification. Further to these sort of fundamental components is the notion that institution and course quality are primarily the responsibility of our institutions, and that these quality assurance agencies' main responsibility is providing a policy framework in which those institutions can autonomously operate. And I think it's also important to mention that the quality assurance system covers all modes of delivery. It's not about just traditional face-to-face study. It's about online, distance, transnational education, so that we can deliver confidence in all AQF qualifications. Cross-sectoral linkages is a very technical term for what we really mean to be the connections between our school, vocational and higher education sectors. The AQF, as I mentioned, is one single comprehensive national qualifications framework. It includes the qualifications from each sector in Australia's education and training system. The AQF is what we call sector neutral. It doesn't apply to one sector more than the other. However, in practice, vocational education and training is offered at AQF levels 1 to 6 and also level 8, and higher education is offered at AQF levels 5 to 10. What isn't particularly apparent in that information is that we have qualifications in vocational education and higher education that are the same. They are the same qualification title, they are on the same level. We also have institutions in Australia that operate as both a vocational education provider and a higher education provider. And this stimulates these links and this mobility between vocational education and higher education. We have the AQF Pathways policy. It focuses on learning outcomes, as the entire framework does, and this policy is about maximising the credit for existing knowledge and skills. It recognises that AQF qualifications can be achieved through formal, non-formal or informal learning. And it supports lifelong learning through really making sure that our institutions are, when they are designing qualifications, are thinking of the pathways into that qualification and the pathways out of that qualification. And those are pathways in terms of not just what qualification do you need to do before and what qualification can you do after, but what sort of labour market experience could you have before, and what kind of employment opportunities can you expect after. And our institutions have to consider this at every stage. But by starting at the qualification design stage, we know that these are integrated at every possible instance, and that qualifications are being designed with this lifelong learning perspective in mind. It also means that pathways have to be very clear, which means that students can make a very well-informed choice about an institution or a qualification that they might be interested in. The recognition of prior learning is another fundamental aspect to the AQF. It's a policy that underpins the AQF. It's an obligation of institutions that deliver AQF qualifications to provide access to the recognition of prior learning. And this is a process whereby the institution assesses the equivalency of learning formal, informal and non-formal learning to the learning outcomes of an AQF qualification. There are a number of different processes depending on the area of specialisation and the institution itself. But the common processes are mapping of learning outcomes, interviewing the student, having a practical assessment either in the workplace or in a simulated environment, and the more traditional approach of exams. And in this way, the AQF is about facilitating the progression of students through their educational career to make sure that they are not having to do formal study for something they already know that they have learned through informal or non-formal learning, which is a waste of resources and a really inefficient approach to education and training. The outcome of recognition of prior learning could be credit in a current program. It could be a statement of attainment. That's not a qualification in itself, but is certifying the competencies that someone has. Or it can lead to an AQF qualification with no formal study required. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about how the AQF facilitates international mobility. I've already mentioned that the AQF supports better understanding of Australian qualifications internationally. That helps people with Australian qualifications move around the world to study or to work. In Australia, the AQF is the basis for our qualifications recognition activities. It supports inbound and outbound mobility in that way. One of the ways that we are starting to look at improving mobility is through the referencing of qualifications frameworks. Around 160 countries in the world now have or will soon have a national qualifications framework. And that brings us opportunities to think about how we work together. including through referencing of national or regional qualifications frameworks. So one example of that is we are engaged in a project with the European Commission to compare the Australian qualifications framework to the European qualifications framework to build that stronger sense of understanding of each other's qualifications. One of the other things we do is to share our expertise in a multilateral environment. So Australia, along with New Zealand, are sharing our expertise to help with the development of the ASEAN Qualifications Reference Framework, which is a regional qualifications framework that is operating in our region, in the Asia Pacific. I'm not sure if I keep touching something, but anyway, I will talk a little about the AQRF if time allows. And I think what we have to flag is that this type of cooperation, whether it's referencing or sharing expertise, is about delivering understanding, but it's not about achieving mutual recognition of each other's qualifications, which is why we also engage with the UNESCO recognition conventions, which establish best practice principles for how we compare qualifications across borders. And I'll talk about that. This is probably the easiest way to represent this kind of work, which is that there are three key policy areas in terms of enhancing mobility and removing barriers to mobility both nationally and internationally, both inbound and outbound, is very much a strategic priority for the Australian government and for many governments around the world. It's beneficial to productivity, to participation, and to internationalisation, of course. And I think as mobility grows and becomes more complex, governments need to think of different ways of working together to take full advantage of the potential for mobility. And I think especially where student and labour mobility are going beyond regional borders, we need to think about ways to cooperate globally for global mobility. Mobility is very much limited without quality assurance, or without systems to recognise each other's qualifications. And qualifications frameworks are increasingly the link between the two. Qualifications frameworks build understanding, they manage diversity, and they provide information about learning outcomes. Quality assurance builds confidence and trust in education systems and qualifications. And qualifications recognition gives effect to mobility by determining if a foreign qualification is fit for study or work purposes based on an understanding of the qualifications framework and how its outcomes are quality assured. And so outcomes are very much the common theme between these policy areas and are a foundation to improving coherence to enhance mobility. And so what we are basically saying is there's no point thinking about quality assurance reforms in isolation. There's no point thinking about a qualifications framework in isolation. If your intent is to build international understanding and international mobility, it is a more complex picture, and you need to think of the complementary policy areas when you are developing these initiatives. Very quickly, I just wanted to talk about the AQF and employment policy. The AQF, we feel, is very much strengthened by the diversity of uses, many of which we did not originally intend when we designed the qualifications framework. We now have a national tool. It's called ANSCO. It describes 600, 700 occupations in Australia and gives an AQF qualification level to each of those occupations. It describes the skills that are expected of someone that is working in that occupation. We have statistical data now that is possible that was not possible before we had the AQF. We can report on employment outcomes by AQF qualifications. We can report on salary ranges by AQF qualifications. And that kind of data is really valuable for informing government policy. And lastly, I just wanted to briefly touch on future directions. I think the really key point is to emphasize that a qualifications framework is never static. It is always evolving. It is always being reviewed to make sure that it is fit for purpose, that it is delivering relevant skills for industry. That means that there's always work going on. There's no time when you can ever say your qualifications framework is done. But what that also means is that there's always potential to influence change. And with the AQF, we maintain very strong relationships with all of our stakeholders and take their feedback on board when undertaking these reviews of the AQF, because the AQF is for everyone that is involved in qualifications in Australia, and everyone needs to have their say in whether the AQF is working for them or how it could work for them better. And so really the next step for us is to continue to strengthen the AQF international alignment policy. That is the policy of how we work with other qualifications frameworks around the world, why we do it, is this the best form of international cooperation, is it delivering the results we want to see? And for us, those results are mobility. And how do you measure success in mobility, of whether working with another qualifications framework, referencing to another qualifications framework, is delivering on those outcomes. And the last thing is really we're doing a lot of work to strengthen the integrity of Australian qualifications through having better, more accessible systems to validate whether a qualification is legitimate or not. And that is of really primary concern for employers, not just in Australia, but around the world, to be able to authenticate an Australian qualifications framework qualification and the results that a student has acquired. So that's something else that we're working on. And I think that was it from me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. As I already told you, I am a president of the Korea Association of Skills and Qualification. I may say, her presentation is so wonderful because if you really want to know about the NQF and then why we need the NQF and how, so what are the basic structure and components or NQF compliance, even other relationship with the other quality assurance system. It's a very wonderful presentation. If you want to become an expert in NQF, please look at the material again, and then I'm sure you will be the expert in that area. Thank you so much again. And let's hear from second presenter, Michael Young, professor. Please join me to welcome Professor Michael Young with a big hand for his presentation.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's very nice to be in your country for the first time, and I'm sorry it's so short, and I hope it won't be the last. I'm very pleased to be following Elizabeth. I think she gave an excellent account of national qualification frameworks from a government point of view. And what struck me in the work that I've done on NQFs is the extraordinary similarity of the documents as produced by different governments, almost to the extent of the same number of levels and so forth. I think there's absolutely no doubt about it that they are a global phenomenon that's here to stay. When I first got involved in this area at all, the beginning of the century, there were 5. and at the last count there were 140. Now that suggests something's happening, and certainly they have spread very fast. And I heard the other day before I left that even China was deciding that it had to have one as well, because they've postponed it for various reasons for some time. Now what I want to do is to put, in a sense, a rather different view. It starts from the fact that I haven't been a policymaker, I haven't been an implementer of qualification frameworks. I've in a sense been a researcher, analysing, asking questions about them. And on the whole, the research community takes a very different view of them, because on the one hand, it sees the statements of governments and international organizations as essentially what they hope would happen, and it bears very little relationship to what actually does happen on the ground. That there is quite an important difference between those two, because there are some very, very tricky issues, some of which have been touched on by Elizabeth, which in fact I will come back to. Unfortunately, the research community, I think, takes it too far and ends up, in a sense, by dismissing the whole notion of qualification frameworks, because they're seen essentially as instruments of bureaucratic control. And therefore they criticize them, and they see them as just another version of neoliberal education policy that follows an economistic view of education. Now, I have some sympathy with those critics as a fellow researcher, but as I say, I think that they only go so far, and they don't help the practitioners or the various stakeholders to actually see how they can make a qualification work better, because there's no doubt about it, they're going to be with us whether any of us like it or not. Not the least because, in fact, the labour markets are increasingly global and national, and this means that there are parallels more than before across different countries. So, in a sense, I want to start from the position that we can actually learn from the critical research, but we don't need to accept the critical research's conclusions, and that we can actually come up with a better way of approaching them. And I think it's very important, what I certainly feel is very important, that we start with what I see as the primary goal of qualification frameworks, which is not necessarily as embracing, perhaps, as sometimes expressed, but they are essentially that, in fact, we all inherit traditional systems of qualifications that block the progression of learners. That is the crucial. And the NQF can possibly, at its best, actually open up pathways that, in fact, previous systems did not. And Elizabeth mentioned the various kinds of unblockings, and I just quickly refer to them briefly. The blockings that if you're on a vocational course, it's very difficult to move to an academic course, that in fact, if you are on a course or a program for one occupation and that particular occupation changes a lot, it's very difficult to move to another. Similarly, the more problematic, and perhaps we'll come back to that, issue that in a sense, if you've been working for some time, you may have got some skills and you want to be able to get them recognized without necessarily doing a whole course to replace them. What I think, and in a sense, what I'm drawing on is the research that I've done in recent years, and in a sense, what that's come up with is a series of questions that are at least marginalized and sometimes neglected by governments in essentially the determination to push the system through. I've seen this in my own country, in UK, and I've seen it even more dramatically so in South Africa since the 1990s and since they managed to get rid of the apartheid. They saw the NQF as one of the instruments for actually making education much, much more equal and not than it had been under apartheid. I mean, in a sense, although that was an admirable goal, it was extraordinarily unrealistic. Most of the work I've done has been associated with the International Labour Office organization in Geneva, and we carried out a project which covered 16 countries in 5 continents, and it was followed up by colleagues of mine on looking at 6 more countries and also a short project in India. One of the things we found was that, in a sense, what we were trying to do is to find out to what extent you could say that NQFs actually achieved any of their goals, or did they stay as essentially things that you wish lists, if you like, which in a sense, and insofar as they were implemented, it was more a question of compliance than actually changing things. So what are the questions that I want to try and ask briefly? The first, I think we actually need to ask the questions, what is an NQF and why should a country want them? And I think we need to remember, because once you start asking those questions, you realize that in a sense you have to have a rather different view of one. An NQF is a kind of map. It's a map which offers a simplified picture of a very complex reality and changing reality. This is the distribution of knowledge and skills across different occupations. Now, in a sense, that discrepancy between the map and the reality makes it extraordinarily important that it doesn't become a technical instrument, because in a sense it doesn't have the knowledge base of what's happening to warrant that. It's as if it gets treated sometimes as a kind of science that you can apply in the same way that you can apply something in physics or technology. So that, in a sense, and this applies both to the horizontal axis of different qualification fields, and also, even to a greater extent, the vertical axis of the hierarchy of skill and knowledge levels, which are assumed across occupational fields. It's not easy at all to achieve agreement on outcome levels across different occupations. And one of the reasons is one example, which I give you, which is I think a very obvious one, is that many occupations basically are not unitary. They actually have, they're binary in the sense that they have a supervisory hierarchy and they have an expertise hierarchy, and they are not part of this, they are not always the same at all. And yet, in a sense, qualification framework, in a sense, fudges that rather tricky issue. Another example, I think, which makes it quite difficult to develop a qualification framework, or at least to treat one as a kind of technical instrument, is that, in fact, some sectors have very few occupations, either at the very low level or at the high level, you get a sector, certainly in my country, like the retail trade, where, in fact, you've got large numbers of low-skill occupations within that sector, and a small group of highly sophisticated top level that are involved in the logistics of transporting food and so forth. But I think, in a sense, the point I want to make really is that there's a deeper issue here, and that is that, in fact, how far can you assume a comparability of the kind that a qualification framework wants to make? And if you can't, then it seems to be critically important that you don't treat it as if you can. So why then do people introduce an NQF, or do governments, and why are they so widely supported by international organizations? What purposes can they achieve? I think the first thing we learned when trying to ask this across a number of countries was, in fact, that there's a great temptation if you're like the European Union or indeed a national government, to treat the NQF as some kind of magic bullet that, in fact, if you introduce it, that in a sense you're able to solve a whole lot of your problems, particularly your human resource problems. And then they become very troubled if they find that in fact this turns out to be far less true than they had hoped, because they don't really know why. An example from the UK was we haven't had from as early in the 80s a national vocational qualification framework, and in a sense we developed it without any great consideration of how it actually might work out in practice. And one of the consequences was that in a sense we had an elaborate framework with a multiple range of qualifications at every level, but very, very few people actually gaining the qualifications. Let's take a couple of issues. One is to do with enhancing progression between lower and higher level qualifications. That is an admirable aim. Nobody would disagree with it, that you want people to have opportunities that they have previously been denied. However, what I think is important to realize is that just because you've got a framework, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have improved progression. Because in a sense, improving progression implies that, or rather what a framework can do is to in fact specify the learning and make it more explicit. But what it can't do is actually to support the learners in moving up or across the framework. There's a particular problem. One solution is to make the outcomes more specific. But this, of course, is a double-edged strategy, because on the one hand, it makes it apparently easier for learners to progress because they can see what the next step is. On the other hand, they're less good at signaling the progress to the learners in terms of how they are progressing. Because if you are going to actually have progression, what students need is to learn more, either knowledge and skills. And in a sense, this depends on things like improvements in pedagogy and the skills and knowledge of teachers and lecturers. In other words, and I think this comes up again and again in relation to qualification frameworks, it's only likely they will achieve their aims if they rely on policies that are not part of the framework of itself. And I think, in a sense, they are in a sense, and it struck me when I was preparing this talk, was that in a sense, NQFs are system change instruments. They're system change instruments. You've really got to grasp what's involved, the system as a whole, and then you can see that qualification frameworks play a role in that change. Governments find it easier to design than to improve NQFs than to improve skills and knowledge. The other thing that is often referred to in relation to NQFs is whether they can improve links between the key stakeholders involved. This is clearly a crucial thing, particularly in relation to vocational qualifications and the links between education and work. Now, in a sense, what I want to say here is, which links to the earlier point, is that if you want to improve the links between education and work, then, in a sense, this will depend primarily on whether there's a change of demand of the skills and knowledge on the part of employers. This is not directly anything to do with the national qualification framework. So it'll only happen, and that will only happen, if in fact there's greater investment and a more innovation-led industrial strategy that makes the demand, that in a sense forces the employers actually will force the creation of the framework so they can actually get the skills and knowledge that they need. And it also depends upon whether or not your teachers actually, and lecturers in your colleges, actually know about the occupations that their students are hoping to go into. And very often, there's long time since they've been involved, and the links between are less and less. So let me just summarize what I've tried to say so far. NQFs can potentially open up new pathways, and they can be instruments for broadening qualifications. But they inevitably depend upon policies which improve demand and complement what a framework can do. Secondly, NQFs can, for instance, this has been an important call, certainly in my country, they can enhance the status of vocational qualifications, that very often are treated as inferior. But in a sense, and that's particularly important, but it crucially depends upon the content and nature of the curriculum of those qualifications. If, for instance, one way of in a sense, improving vocational qualifications is to emphasize the common element between the vocational and the academic, so that in a sense the barriers are less. Now, that's fine from the point of view of progression between the two, but if it's emphasized too much, the specificity of particular skills and knowledge can actually be lost. And the result, in a sense, is that you may get more qualified learners, but you'll get qualified learners who can do and know less. I think the balance between the general that's common to more than one kind of qualification and the particular elements of knowledge skills is always a tricky matter of judgment among those particular stakeholders and whether they can actually are aware of that background. I want to raise a question about different types of framework, because as I mentioned at the beginning, the similarity between NQFs, and I think that is true, in a sense, and there's a tendency to assume, therefore, that in a sense, an NQF is an NQF, that there are no types. In practice, there's quite a lot of diversity across the 142 if you start looking at them, and it's quite important to see about that diversity, because in fact that says something about their different purposes. I'll just mention a few very quickly. First is the fact that they vary enormously in range. Some of them do only vocational, some do vocational general, some do vocational general and higher, and obviously depending on the extent of your range, different kinds of problems, particularly in relation to stakeholders, are important. Secondly, there's the question of the role of government and the state. In some countries, in fact, the NQF is voluntary, that in fact both colleges and lecturers and teachers and employers can either opt in or opt out in it. This is particularly true of the Scottish Qualification Framework, and one of the reasons why it's often seen as a pathfinder of success. Others, and we adopted this, and so I think to New Zealand initially, and maybe in other countries, and South Africa, that in fact the qualification framework was compulsory. And in a sense, what that achieved was a lot of conflict, a lot of resistance, and consequences that almost certainly didn't achieve the aims of the framework. So in a sense, there are pros and cons about that, but it's very important to be aware. I mean, one of the things that was important about the Scottish Qualification Framework is that it wasn't compulsory, that in a sense, therefore it wasn't a sense of government imposing a policy on the education or indeed on the employers, but it did focus on the question of communication between groups who are deeply involved in progression, but in fact hadn't historically had much in common. So some people have actually labeled it a communications framework, because that's a very important part of a framework if it's going to actually achieve its aims. There's a question about how you implement. If you're starting, I don't know how far Korea's got in relation to its own qualification framework, but we had a very interesting, a colleague of mine actually were invited by the World Bank to go and help the India introduce a qualification framework for their vocational qualifications. And it was very clear when we got there that in a sense the government wanted a compulsory written framework all mapped out initially. That's what they thought was the way to do it. We found enormous diversity across sectors, across states, 36 different states, and even across government departments, two different qualification frameworks were being designed by two different departments at the time. And we thought that, in a sense, that model was create enormous difficulties. And what we thought was that, in a sense, if you want to start a framework, particularly if you've got a lot of weak sectors, occupational sectors, then you actually choose some of those linked sectors that, in fact, already have quite good provision, and you, in a sense, you build a sectoral framework out of that, which then can become the basis for more than one sectoral framework. So you have a kind of incremental way of developing, rather than the top-down, starting with the framework. There's a much better chance that you get a framework that's actually organic to the realities of the country that you're working in. Unfortunately, well, not for us, because we left, we'd done what we could, but the Indian government clearly didn't like it, and as far as I know, they haven't got very far in trying to actually achieve one. I'll just very mention briefly, because it's a particular issue that we face in the UK, or in England, if you like, and that is, in fact, there are very different framework structures. I mean, there was a debate in England between whether you go for a unified framework, but all the qualifications are located clearly on one single framework. And then the opposite to that, really, is to accept a divided framework, where basically you have a framework for general qualifications and a framework for vocational qualifications. And you have the academic vocational divide built into the framework. The government in the Labour government, our Labour government, in about the early part of the first decade, actually commissioned a report which came up with something in between, which it called a connective framework, where, in a sense, it had one framework with vocational and academic qualifications, but with elements of each, so that, in fact, the academic qualifications had some vocational components, and the vocational qualifications had some academic components. And that, in a sense, the report argued, I think quite convincingly, that this was, in a sense, could well be the future of the labour market, and not only a way of resolving the problem. It got thrown out by our government, because the assumption was that if you no longer have a separate academic set of pathways, you will no longer have the high quality that you are assumed to have in those qualifications in terms of entry to university and so forth. So that, in a sense, that's what happened. And as far as, and what's happened since is we have a rather fragmented version of a divided framework to this day. And the last general point which I want to make is this issue, which I think has to be said again and again and again. And this is the issue of the importance of policies associated that are not part of the framework if you actually want the framework to actually achieve any of its aims. And these are likely, and this is really for two reasons, I think. One is that the NQF itself is a system-wide reform, and secondly, that the NQF has to actually be seen, that's why it's relevant to this conference, this forum, it has to be seen as a human resource strategy that actually includes a whole number of things such as professional development and in-service education and so forth. Those components, if it's not seen to include those, then it's absolutely bound to fail, because people will not have the expertise to be able to make use of even a more flexibly designed qualification framework. I want to give you briefly one or two examples to illustrate, in a sense, how one might actually approach an NQF or qualification in a sense, in a more constructive way, and there might be lessons. I'm going to take two examples from England, the healthcare and the accounting sectors. One example from Norway, and also briefly to mention Scotland. Scotland's almost always recognised as a success in its framework, and they market it around the world. And as far as I heard recently, that they just got a contract to go and implement one based on what they've done in Saudi Arabia with a vast, they've made a lot of money out of that anyway. Now, I think it's important to remember, and this would be different from Korea, that Scotland's a very small country. It's only got 5 million people, which makes it much easier to bring people together. And therefore, the stakeholder issue is not such of a problem. It's got a group of college providers for vocational education that are quite well regarded. That's also important. It has a tradition, and this is important, I think, a cultural issue. It has a tradition of consensus rather than competition between occupations, colleges and schools, employers and educators and so forth. This has made actually a voluntary framework actually possible rather than being imposed. And the last thing is that it didn't have dramatically high expectations about what an NQF could do. And that's one of the reasons why I think what actually it's done is to achieve where it has communication between stakeholders who had not historically worked together. Very, very different experience from England. Now, I want two rather narrower, but nevertheless they have implications examples, I think important examples. Particularly in relation to the issue of human resource strategy. One was a large health authority in the north of England. Now, what they did was to develop a human resource strategy covering staff at all levels, from specialist surgeons in hospitals to community care workers working with old people who may have very little qualifications at that stage at all, and also the local education and training providers as well. Now, so they started with all of the stakeholders involved. They drew on the framework, the VQ framework, as an incentive for the lower level employees to actually improve their skills and so gain promotion, and also support the medical profession who actually wanted more effective care in the community. So this is an example which I think is a lesson, is the national framework was only one component in a strategy that was initiated by the equivalent of the employer, and the key factor was the involvement and interest of all the stakeholders. The second example has parallels with this, and it's the accountancy occupation sector in England, and there are basically broadly two kinds of accountants: the accountancy technicians and the professional accountants. And the accountancy technicians work for the professional accountants. Now, this is an interesting case because, and it's almost unique, is the profession designed the qualifications of the accountancy technicians. And the reason why they did this, and then they were a high-status profession, so they were able to lean on government and say, we will do this regardless of your framework. Okay, I've seen the minute. And the reason why they did this is that they were very dependent upon the work of the technicians for their audit work that they did in companies. So in a sense, if they got the technicians, if they raised the standards through the qualification of technicians, then this was actually in their interests. And the other thing that happened from the point of view of the technicians, because they were high standard designed by the profession qualifications, something like 30% of them who'd left school at 16, started on level 1, level 2 qualifications, ended up being on courses to become fully chartered accountants later. And that's very rare and wouldn't happen in any other occupation that I'm aware of, certainly not in England. The point here is that the MVQ framework played a role in the progression of the accountancy technicians because it was in the interest of the other stakeholder, the accountants themselves. And it was the involvement of the accountancy profession, both in designing technician qualifications and supporting their progression to become accountants, that was important. And in a sense, the framework played a role in facilitating that possibility. The last one, for example, is slightly devious, but I think it's important, is from Norway. Norway were introducing an NQF at higher education level, and the focus they had, which was on the qualification, the higher education, the degree qualifications, actually being expressed in learning outcomes. And what was interesting about this is that that the research demonstrated, and it's going to be published as a special issue of the European Journal of Education in a couple of issues' time. They were able to the researchers were able to demonstrate that the framework had a pedagogic role rather than just certification role for the national framework. In other words, learning outcomes weren't just part of assessment. They actually provided a context for the lecturers to reassess their own teaching and learning in light of of discussions about what they found out about what learners were needing and wanted. I mention this because I certainly, for a long time, been very critical of learning outcomes. I thought inevitably they led to assessment driving the curriculum rather than the reverse. And what is interesting, I think, about the Norwegian case is it focused on the context of the use of an NQF. It created a context not of determining what lecturers did, but of enabling them to question their pedagogic methods in light of outcomes that they might be expected. So in a sense, what I'm saying, and I'll conclude there, is that in fact the crucial thing in a sense is how the framework is interpreted by the stakeholders involved, and also whether they are able to see that it's actually part of a broader strategy rather than just something to implement assessment. But I think we need to remember that an NQS is a very small part of any kind of whole system reform. And if you treat it, if it's treated as an isolated technical instrument, it'll achieve very little and could actually even be counterproductive. And the other thing to say is that I think it's the key issue, which is almost always neglected by government, is that in fact an NQF will only achieve its broader aims if the different stakeholders see it expressing their interests and their priorities. It's a more complex thing, I think, than we'd realized. But, and then we need to ask the question, who are the stakeholders and are they involved? Because often they're not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Based on his experience, a lot of experience with consultation in other countries, he really shared vivid lessons from his experience. Thank you very much. But I would like to emphasize, two things from his presentation. He said only 5 countries in 2004, but right now like 150 countries have done NQF or trying to working hard. And then another thing is he said NQF is just like the maps, because so simplified pictures of more complex reality. But don't forget, without map, it's very difficult to find the place. So that's just my impression. Anyway, last we have a wonderful discussion, especially from the Korea perspective. Please, join me. Welcome Dr. Jeong for his discussion.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to appreciate your wonderful presentation. In order to facilitate communication, present an audience participating in this forum, I raised some questions to presenters. First, as per Australian Qualification Framework, which is quite familiar with Korean scholars and experts, I would like to raise 2 points. First, given that AQF supports national productivity, already you mentioned, how do you measure the productivity increased by implementing AQF? What are the clear evidence to prove productivity increased, directly or indirectly, resulting from application of AQF to education and training and qualification system? This is my first question. The second, as you mentioned in your presentation, securing AQF availability in labor market, AQF could integrate within labor market in the context of salary scales, workforce planning, and statistical data collection, and so on. Now that Korea is struggling to make a plan of how to linkage, KQF, Korean Qualification Framework, with the labor market. We need some more, maybe your comments regarding this issue, which will be a good topic, the collaborating between Australia and Korea to share both countries' experience. Please give us some more information, comments on this issue. And then I will go to Professor Michael Young's presentation. Based on his remarkable experience over quite a long period in qualification framework areas, he gave us valuable implications in terms of how to design, how to operate and manage a national qualification framework. Still, Korea has qualification system that also leftovers of early industrial era with few connection between qualification pathways. But fortunately, it offers enough level of opportunities for making progression to the higher education. Your presentation point out that improving progression pathway while giving equal value to vocational and academic qualification is about changing people's mind and identities. And NQF can help this process of change. The Korea side wants to make a strategy of how to change the public mindset to accept NQF ideal, leading to establish a competence-based society apart from credentialism coming from Confucianism in the past. I would like to ask you your present best examples to change public mindset based on your extraordinary experience. The second, current Korean approach to introduce NQF show more or less similarity with early England experience that is being regarded NQF as an instrument for reforming the provision of academic and vocational qualification. In this context, encouraging employer and educational institution collaboration is more important than shifting power from education providers toward employers to Korean government. The Korea side nearly wants to avoid resistance coming from big stakeholders, including university, by introducing NQF. I think that England continuously attempt to overcome early failed experience, already you mentioned, which will be valuable to Korea, including current effort to fit for their purpose of England qualification framework. And please share with your insight of England case from standpoint of Korea. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. So Elizabeth, would you answer to his question?
Sure. It's not an easy question, but I'm not here for the easy questions, I suppose. I think how you measure a productivity increase comes down to how you define productivity. And definitely, I agree in many respects with what Michael was saying, which is that governments are not very good at doing the research that proves the objectives of a qualifications framework have been achieved. So I wish I had some very beautiful graphs that could show you we had the AQF introduced in 1995 and then productivity went up. I don't. But I think how we think of the productivity increase that has been generated from the AQF is really about participation rates in employment and participation rates in meaningful employment. That is the rates of Australian workers that are either underqualified or more accurately overqualified for the work that they are doing. And the AQF has provided an avenue for allowing our Department of Employment, our Ministry of Employment, to do that kind of analysis. And I'm not saying that that couldn't have been possible without the AQF, but the AQF has been a tool that has enabled employer engagement in the education and training sector. And so they now see how they fit in the national productivity picture, how they can influence the development of the labour market, the people for the labour market that they see, and the skills that they need for their workers to drive productivity within individual businesses, whether they're small, medium or large enterprises. So no easy answer on that, but the data is there and we're able to analyse it in a way that was not possible when we didn't have the AQF. And in many ways that transitions to your second question about how the best ways of integrating qualifications frameworks with the labour market. And I think that, again, that comes down to defining the role of employers in the qualifications framework. And I definitely agree with Michael that that should happen at the earliest possible stages, because the qualifications framework isn't for government, it isn't for the students, it isn't necessarily for the institutions, it's for all users of qualifications, even secondary people who benefit in a secondary kind of way from qualification systems. And so in Australia we have an industry-led qualification system, that it is industry that designs the skills, the competencies that that comprise our vocational qualifications on the AQF, and therefore they are primarily responsible for designing the programs that are delivering the workers. And if they are dissatisfied with the skills that the workers have, then they have the ability to change the qualifications. And that is really critical. And then in the higher education space, we have the professions, similar in a way to the accountancy example that Michael gave. Because there is now this shared tool that employers understand, that higher education institutions understand, that students and parents and government, we all understand it, it means we can have more meaningful conversations because we are speaking the same language now, which perhaps before the AQF we weren't necessarily doing. And so whilst we have the industry-led vocational sector, the professions have a major role in accrediting the professional degrees. And again, that's about designing the skills that are necessary, and then working with our higher education institutions with the skills that they have to actually deliver training, deliver education. So it's about cooperation, it's about communication, and I think that a qualifications framework provides that common language for everyone to have those meaningful conversations.
Okay, thank you. What about Michael Young?
Thanks. I hope I've understood your first question. That was about the change of mindset that is implied by the qualification framework as opposed to the old qualification system in relation particularly to opportunities in higher education. This relates actually to a broader issue. And the broader issue, to my mind, is what are the purposes of the qualification framework? Elizabeth said in Australia, and it's true, I think, in almost all the countries that I've been, that in a sense, qualification frameworks are either industry-driven or governments attempt to make industry drive, as in the UK case. But maybe that is, in a sense, a mistake. Maybe we overemphasize industry, particularly at a time when industry looks as though it's not going to go on achieving more and more jobs. And so we may need to not to abolish the framework, because the framework actually, which focuses on progression, is, I think, always going to be necessary, both internationally and nationally, and also for kids who drop out and want to come back. There are a whole lot of reasons why you want a framework that are not just about improving the economy. And there's, in a sense, maybe there's a kind of broader set of more educational life purposes that we should associate a framework with, which we haven't up till now. That relates, of course, to the second point I think you made about the fact that converting qualifications from being provider-led, and actually this was basically an anti-union view of Margaret Thatcher, if you remember her, that in a sense the unions had a very big role in qualifications up until the 80s in England, and the government wanted to break that, the union college link, and actually shift the power to the employers. And that, of course, that's only a sensible step if you've got employers that are going to deliver what you actually want them to. And in a sense, so it's a question of what employers. And one of the things that we have, and it would be interesting to make a comparison between us, say, in a country like Germany, is that there's still a different notion of the purposes of work in Germany than there is, for instance, in the UK. And maybe you're a bit more like Germany than we are. But I was very struck, to give you one example, that if you want to work in a shop, just selling in a retail shop, you have to do 3 years as apprenticeship in Germany and to get your qualification at the end. Now, whereas in fact our employers recruit people who've got no skills or qualifications at all for low-level jobs. Now, there's a difference in the notion of work in those two. I think it's something to really think about. The other thing really is, I think, or two things. One in relation to Elizabeth. You said that in Australia you've got this AQF which is shareable. I would say that it's not necessarily share. It may be shareable, but it's not necessarily shared. It's a different step to make sure that those stakeholders are actually sharing and that they can share it. Governments can do something about making it shareable, but then it's a more complex thing to make it shared. And in a sense, I think we need a bigger, and if you're at the beginning of an AQF, that is a rather nice place to be, because we've got a history of a failed one. At least you haven't got that yet. I won't say whether yours succeeded or not. I'll leave that for you. But the point is, I think we need to think in a different way about qualifications in a context where, in fact, people may spend a lot of their life without jobs. That in fact, and that is a very different context where I don't think we begin to open up. Anyway.
Very much. Is anybody have a question for the presenter and the discussant from the floor? A staff gave me memo. There is no question from the floor. Is that right? Okay. So, two presenter and one discussion. Even if we got almost out of time, but we have 5 minutes. But some staff told me we could use more than 5:30. So, anyway, would you like to add some words for the audience? No. Want to finish it? Okay. Thank you very much. And I want to add some stuff because. In Korea, we have a special situation in terms of the, highly, depending on private tutoring or too much cost of education, even overqualification. Even if many young people have a, bachelor degree, even higher than, but could find it difficult, job right now. That's not only the due to economic, recession. There are a lot of problems. I believe in Korea we try to establishing NQF because that is the core of the building competence-based society. I'm not sure how many of you really understand the definition of a qualification, because there are so many different kinds of qualification, including college degree, even like a school graduation certificate or technical qualification, even others, so many different kinds of the evidence and award indicated that person kind of have some level of the abilities in certain area. But in Korea, we just always like academic degree and diploma, the only standard for recognition. When you find a job or when you get a chance for promotion, always depends on what level of the education and background. That's it. So that's why for the government, we try to set up the kind of a competence-based society through establishing NQF. So, Elizabeth already like presented many purposes, objectives, and goals of the NQF. I believe that is true, but right now we are working on for that. We need to understand some things because I, as an expert in that area, I found there are some misconception about establishing NQF. So I would like to mention about four different things on misunderstanding. Firstly, the focus of shifting from academic reliance toward the competence-based society has been misinterpreted. Means as academic ability or degree being no longer need. That's not true. Still we need it. And secondly, is the misunderstanding about relationship between the National Qualification Framework and the Vocational Qualification Framework. Vocational Qualification Framework is not constituent of the National Qualification Framework, just a part of it. And then also, thirdly, there is a misconception whereby the vertical and the horizontal hierarchy, such as the academic ability, degree, and qualification, could act as vocational qualification standard. There is also another misunderstanding that the application of a national qualification framework is confined to national context and applies only to several industries. National qualification framework is not limited to only local context, but its significance also extends to ensure international mobility. As I remember, European qualification framework, the reason why they set up that kind of a system because promote talent people mobility as well as try to bridge from people to higher education. So we need to understand why government try to set up the national qualification framework. Also, I would like to add one more thing, in order to government to set up the NQF, it's kind of really centralized approach from the administration perspective. That's not true. Our Korea, our administration tried to decentralize in all, various aspects of education administration. So in order to decentralization, especially connect to education and employment, we need a kind of infrastructure. That is the one of the national qualification framework, as I believe. Anyway, it's time to finish our session.
Just a moment, Chair.
You want to add some?
Yeah. This is adequate time to talk about Asian Qualification Reference Frameworks. Already we mentioned that this is a good chance sharing the concept of Asian Qualification Reference Framework. Briefly, you can maybe introduce AQF.
Okay, yeah,
Thank you.
right. Actually, there are some ASEAN country try to set up the kind of ASEAN qualification framework right now. So Elizabeth is mention about it.
Yes, so within the Asia Pacific region, the 10 ASEAN countries, that's the Southeast Asian countries, have been working since 2010 to develop a regional qualifications framework that will enable the comparison of qualifications across those countries. The context for that is very much economic development with the establishment of the ASEAN Economic Community in 2015. There is a view that borderless labour mobility is really essential for the future of the ASEAN region. And it's linked very much also with the development of compatible national qualifications frameworks and quality reforms. So it's not possible to do just the qualifications framework. To build that trust and confidence that leads to mobility, there needs to be the quality assurance there as well. It's got the usual features of a qualifications framework. It encourages lifelong learning. It facilitates the recognition of non-formal and informal learning as well. Very much whilst this is an ASEAN project and it's under the free trade agreement that Australia and New Zealand have with ASEAN countries, it is expected to become the default Asia-Pacific qualifications reference framework. The ASEAN countries have been very open with sharing their experiences, and the ASEAN qualifications reference framework has been picked up in APEC to become part of the APEC integrated reference framework, which is a lot of different words, but all very similar projects that aim to enhance understanding of qualifications, improve quality of qualifications, and lead to easier mobility of students, of workers, for greater economic development.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Okay, it's time to finish our session. Please give a big hand to our two presenters and one discussion. I also thank you to the participants who have listened until this moment. That is all for our session. Thank you very much.